morning,
Thank
Kelly.
you so much. I thank you so much for joining me today so that we can talk about stories of inclusion. As I began thinking about having these conversations and taking people on a journey, what does it take to be compassionate about diversity and inclusion? What does it take to want to be who we think we are, right? Because that's the thing. Oftentimes we walk around and we say, I'm a good person. I treat everybody like myself and or like I want to be treated. And that feels like it should be enough. But you and I both know that there's a little bit more work that goes into truly creating inclusive spaces. And so I've always been curious. I think that a big part of cultural competence is developing a certain level of curiosity about others and their life experiences and how they do what they do. And so this process of stories of inclusion that I have kicked off, this new series, is really going to provide me with an opportunity to chat with people who I've identified as co-collaborators in this work, and ones that I feel like are working hard in order to truly create change in their organizations. And some people I just want to talk to about who they are, right? So over this time period, I'll be talking to you, I'll be talking to my mentor at the Center for the Healing of Racism, I'll be talking to several of my friends and colleagues that have been doing this work for a long time to find out, just what does it take and what put us on the path, right? So Matt, before we get started, why don't you tell us just a little bit about what it is that you do? What's your position?
Absolutely. Just for the last 8 months, I have been the division commander for the Gilcrease division of the Tulsa Police Department. Mm-hmm. And so for anybody who's watching who doesn't live in Tulsa, that is one of our patrol divisions, and that we serve Tulsans living roughly north of 11th Street, including all of downtown.
Oh, thank you. And Matt and I met, now, what has it been, Matt, about 3-4 years ago or so?
4 years.
Yeah, so about 4 years ago, as TPD was embarking upon their journey of unconscious bias work. And so they were in search for a consultant for that. And through some rigorous selection process, I managed to be the lucky consultant to be selected to work with the TPD. So over the last 4 years, we've been putting together a program inside of the Tulsa Police Department that addresses cultural competence. And we believe that we have a really strong team in there that is doing some great work. But what we're here to talk about is not necessarily that work. If it comes up, fine. But what we're really here to talk about is your journey, Matt. So what are some of your experiences in your background that put you on the path to inclusion, honestly? So what brought you here?
Thank you for asking. I grew up in North Dallas, mostly in a city called Plano, and Plano was known for two things: being a very snooty city and having really high rate of teenage suicide. And part of that was in that city that there's a lot of classism, and if you have two nickels to rub together, you make sure that you rub that in somebody's face that only has one. It's an interesting place to be, and I didn't realize that it was a fairly diverse city until I moved to Weatherford, Oklahoma for college, and realized, okay, I did live in a diverse place. I just didn't know it at the time. And I probably fell into the fallacy of the colorblind mindset, that I'm colorblind, everybody's the same. If you treat people like you want to be treated, then everything will work out fine because we're essentially the same.
Right.
And you've taught me a lot since then, and I know better. A story where my colorblindness showed in sort of a funny way. In middle school, my best friend was a guy named Chris Bolton, African-American guy that we knew each other through sports. And I stayed the night at his house one time, and we watched a house party, kid and play, and listened to Boys to Men. And we slept, and the next day I woke up and I went to his bathroom looking for a brush. And I'm looking everywhere and I can't find a hairbrush. And I find a hair pick. I have no idea what it is. I walk in there and say, Chris, where's your hairbrush? He just started laughing. Geez. I don't use that. What are you talking about? And I realized, okay, that there's we're different in certain ways. We shared a lot, and I hadn't really thought about it before.
Mm.
Also, my mom was a special ed teacher's aide.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 1980s, when I was growing up, they used to lump all the kids that weren't, quote, mainstream into one classroom. And so kids who were visually impaired, kids who were deaf, kids with physical impairments, kids who were emotionally disturbed, they were all put in the same classroom before they started to develop that curriculum and do better at serving those kids. But because I saw her in her work all the time and hung around those kids, I got to really have an appreciation. I got over my discomfort of seeing somebody different than me, and really started to get comfortable around those kids and saw their humanity, which got me involved in Special Olympics and the Little Lighthouse here in Tulsa and other things later on in life.
Yeah.
But it helped me see a wider variety.
Yeah. So it expanded your worldview, basically, because you're surrounded by people who had different experiences than your own. And the more intimacy that you had with those folks, the more you realize that at the end of the day, we're more alike than we are different.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And so one of the things that I think that, we've talked a lot about in both in private conversation as well as in the training is that sometimes that has also been a challenge, right? Saying that we are more alike than we are different, right? Because that's that minimization stage that we know can kind of keep us in a place where we then begin to think that everybody's experience is just like ours because we are more alike than we are different, right? But but when we really kind of unpeel that onion, we really discover that that's the first step, is to realize that we're more alike than we are different. And then the next step then becomes discovering in what ways are we different, right? And I know that you've talked about that too, because once you discovered that pick, you were like, okay, well then maybe there are some ways that we're different. All this time I was thinking that he was just like me, and then he didn't have a brush. Yeah. So when you think of, when we start having those experiences, it really begins to create these really great conversations. When I was in college, I remember I had an incredibly diverse group of friends in college, but like you, my experience, well, unlike you actually, I grew up in an incredibly homogenous community where everyone was African-American. And if they weren't African-American, then we assumed they were African-American, because otherwise, what were they doing there? I had a couple of friends that were mixed. Nobody knew, I had several friends that were mixed with either white or a Latino, and nobody knew, even though my friend's name was Tony Ortega. You would think that that would have meant something to me, but at the time it didn't. And so our experiences, I thought that everybody was the same. And it wasn't until I went away to college in the suburbs of Chicago, because I'm originally from Chicago, that I started having these encounters with people who were very different from me. And my first roommate, her name was Heidi. And so our experience of discovering each other's backgrounds and something as simple as hair products brought about some really deep conversation that neither of us really thought about. And so it kind of, again, as we talked about, it opened up our minds and our eyes on how people can be different from us. I know that in my life, as I was growing up, as I said, on the south side of Chicago, some of the messages that I received about the police department was that they were unsafe. So when we were out as children, we would run away from police if we saw them coming, and we didn't know why. That was just the thing that you did. If the police are coming, run, everybody run, right? So, and we weren't doing, we really were not doing anything, but that's what we did. And I've shared with you that I have had a really interesting history with officers because of the fact that I have had really important people in my life who have been police officers. My uncle was killed in the line of duty in Chicago, and the impact that that had on our life, on the life of my cousins, was something that I remember having such a deep sense of pain, because not only was he my uncle, but people of the community came out in ways and said that he was the person who we really, really care about. So I have this experience with a police officer who is my uncle, whom we loved and cared for deeply and recognized the impact of the loss on my family. And then as I age and start driving, and admittedly, I like to drive fast. On one particular moment, I was pulled over by an officer, and that encounter was something that stays with me to this day. And I was sexually assaulted by the officer. He asked me to reveal myself to him, and then he would let me go. At that point, I didn't know what to do but do what I was told. And driving away, that sense of fear was with me and is still with me to this day. So that's oftentimes when I hear the whirring of a police signal, if it's coming behind me, my blood runs completely cold. Now, these are two contrasting experiences, right, that have me sitting in this space of cognitive dissonance, and then, which is why I felt like I might be a good candidate to do the work in the police department, because I had those experiences, and know that when I came back to my stepfather, who was also a Chicago police officer, he said that that's not a cop, right? And so that was an important thing for me to hear as well. And we still have this really complicated relationship as a culture with the way that we are in relationship with officers. And so knowing that, and knowing the fraternity and the community of police officers and how completely tight-knit it can be and very protective of one another, I know that it's hard to speak out against or to challenge the system of that fraternal order. So can you tell me just a little bit about what has been the most difficult part of championing diversity and inclusion within the Tulsa Police Department? What's been hard about that?
You know, the stories you just shared, every time we would start one of our classes, and the curriculum that you developed, we taught it to all 800 plus police officers throughout 2019. And I shared all of those stories. And I would watch their faces when I would mention the bad experiences you had, because every police officer fears when they meet somebody new that the first thing they're going to hear is a bad experience somebody had.
Right.
And because, you know, there are several. And then when I shared your family connection, I would see the wall start to come down, because, okay, you know, she's had positive experiences too, and they're glad for that. But really what brings it home every time is when you mentioned the story about your family member who said, that's not a police officer, that's a criminal who is masquerading as a police officer. And then I see the heads nodding, like, thank you, you know, that is not what we do. That is not who we are. And to bring that message to police officers in a time when they feel like they're embattled, that they can't seem to do anything right. The biggest challenge was finding the right instructors and ambassadors to roll that program out. Because cop culture, there's a trend towards insulation, that because we see horrible things, we see atrocities, we see dead babies, we see people beaten to death, we see people shot, that we tend to have a more realistic view of the world than other people do. And as a sidebar, there's an author named Kevin Gilmartin, previous law enforcement, and now he has a PhD in psychology, and he wrote a book called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. And he talks about how police officers, when you stay within that echo chamber and that insulated culture, that you start to lose a little bit of perspective on the rest of the world. And in a funny but telling anecdote, when he teaches his class, which he came and taught in Tulsa a few years ago, he said, you guys think you see the real world and that everybody else, you know, has the wool over their eyes. But I'm going to prove to you that you're the ones who have a distorted view because of what you have to encounter every day. And he said, I'm going to put a word on the screen and you react to it. And the word he put up was department store Santa. And everybody started hissing, saying, "Oh, that's a bad guy. That's a weirdo. That's a child molester." And he said, "No, this is a guy who loves children and wants to bring Christmas spirit to them." I mean, that really resonated with me because yes. And then he put up Boy Scout leader, same reaction, because officers have seen people in those roles corrupted, and we don't see all the ones who are just doing a good job. Right. And so that what you frame as the real world is a small portion of it. And it can, if you don't maintain balance, if you don't maintain non-police friends, non-police activities, you can get kind of sucked into that vacuum. And so having an outside person, that doesn't know the 800 police officers that we have come in and teach would have been difficult. Honestly, we couldn't have afforded to pay you what you deserve to do that. And it was 32 weeks of the year that we were teaching this. Yeah. And so you and I came up with this cadre of instructors, and we had to have somebody for everybody. We had to have different genders, orientations, ages, politics. One of the people that I approached was a skeptic. And I told you about his concerns, and you said, you got to get that guy. You have to have a skeptic teaching this. Because some people were all in and they said, man, I was born to do this. I'm trained to do this. Let's go do it. I don't care if it's tough or embarrassing. I'm going to get in front of everybody. And other people came kicking and screaming, but they came anyways. And so finding this group that represented a wide cross section, and we talked about during the program building a cultural detective lens for police work. And a big part of that is experience. Experience breeds respect among police officers. You're a rookie until you're not. And so a 20-year officer carries more weight than a 3-year officer in most cases. So I couldn't have a bunch of 3-year people teaching a bunch of 25-year officers. So we brought in some 25-year officers to teach as well for credibility, for the veteran officers. And so finding this group, keeping them engaged. Some of them dropped off, as you recall, along the way because for their own reasons, and I respect that. And then the ones who dug in did amazing things. But as the year went on, it was also challenging to keep the morale up because some classes would be hijacked by a skeptic, and it would be excruciatingly difficult. And those classes didn't necessarily have a lot of pushback. They just went dead silent. And we would hear from some of those people later, hey, I really enjoyed it, but I was afraid to speak up. And those were way more difficult than the ones where people pushed back. Those were fun because we could have dialogue. And so to answer your question, the toughest part was finding the people who are willing to do the work and having the courage to get up in front of their peers, not only to present challenging material, but also to go back to their respective assignments and have to answer questions about it throughout the year. And so before this even started, they knew it was coming for 6 months, and they would get, why do we need this? I'm not racist. Why are we doing this right now? Shouldn't we be doing some sort of training that helps us stay alive? Shooting training or, how to protect yourself. And what invariably happened was when the program rolled out, most people said, okay, that's not what I thought it was going to be at all. I enjoyed it. At worst, it was, it wasn't bad. And so I consider that a victory. Because of, we were overcoming months and months of preconceptions and people taking quotes and articles where I was quoted out of context and just finding reasons to be angry. And I just needed to get them in the classroom because the instructors were brilliant. And they were really good at winning people over, and they're not you, but you train them, and they got to be subject matter experts by the end of the year because they taught it again and again. And by the end of the year, there was really no question that they couldn't answer. At the beginning, it didn't seem like we could answer any question. Kelli, what do I say?
Everybody was afraid. I'm supposed to answer questions to that?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I have to say that it was a pleasure to be able to co-create the material with the officers, so I came with curriculum in hand, of course, as a result of the conversation, the research, the interviews, et cetera, being able to say, okay, here's what I know about the organization, and these are the areas that we need to work on. So we did the assessments and all of that, and brought that training to the officers and said, all right, what's gonna stick for people? And some of the material was designed to let's ease you into this conversation, because what we don't want to do is to have you shut the door on us right away, or we won't be productive here.
Yes.
So let's ease you into this in a way that you can be open to hearing what it is that we have to say. And then we got deeper and deeper and deeper into the material. And some of the topics, like the history of relationships between African Americans specifically and police officers, was probably one of the hardest ones to take, when the room would get the most quiet, and when the officers were, the training officers were most concerned about making sure that they hit it just right, because of knowing the pushback and the questions that they might get. And so I think that it was, a lot of people were pushing for this training, not just within the police department, but also the community. And I told people a lot, I feel the weight of the world on my shoulders, because people are going to expect an overnight flip, and for them to be able to feel immediately the results of a training. Well, you and I both know that it's more to it than just this. This is the first step. This is the part of the process that is bringing people to the table, frankly.
Yes.
And then from here, we can go deeper, broader, etc. But that it's not the end of it, right?
I'm glad you mentioned that history piece, because that was a tough one, because a common refrain from people who are breaking into cultural competence is, that has nothing to do with me. I wasn't alive then. I'm not racist. I didn't perpetuate racism. And so why is this relevant to me? And, and you hear that for the last many years of you doing this from any corporation you go to, I know. And when we heard it as well. And so explaining that history, along with generational trauma, has led to where we are today. And so you can't, as a police officer, show up on a call and expect that how you act right then is going to be this reaction you get from the person you're talking to. Because there's a lifetime of experiences for both the officer and the person that are going to color that experience. And so the thought that every novel interaction that I have is going to go as well as I can make it go is nice, but it's not reality. That there's deeply rooted pain in history that creates potential for negative interactions. And I'm glad that you addressed the history and didn't sidestep it with us. I know that you didn't want to, but as we were trying to figure out what to leave in and what to take out, that was critical, and it was difficult. But our instructors became very skillful at navigating that and explaining. And when I attended the Racial Equality Institute, they put it really well. There are, without a doubt, systemic racism throughout the country and in the justice system. That does not necessarily mean that the people involved in it are racist, but the systems, by their history, and that's a deeper dive than we have to get into today. But once the light bulb goes on there, that me saying that systemic racism exists is not me saying that you're a racist. That's a huge bridge to get over. Yeah. Or saying that, systemic racism exists within the police department, right? Because that's something that is hard for people to say. We are such an individualistic society that if you hear something that's a part of an organization that you're in, then immediately you think that is a personal attack on you. But we talked about this even in the training, the difference between interpersonal racism and institutional racism, and making sure that people were clear on the difference and what we were talking about. And that was another difficult one that the officers were like, I'm supposed to be able to explain that,
but ultimately ended up being able to do it and do it well. And so I think that the work that has to be done is we have to be willing to listen to one another instead of assuming that the way that we have always done things is the right thing for our culture and or our community, particularly when we don't have access to one another. Yeah. So, or if the only access that we have to one another is when it is in a negative light. So if the only interaction that an officer has with African-American people is in policing, then there's no way possible that you can have a well-rounded view of who those people could potentially be if that is the only view, right? And so I think that and vice versa, if the only interaction that the community has with police is when they are being policed,
yes,
then it's going to be impossible for them to have a positive outlook or a wider look on that community. And so, and what's the answer? Honestly, I think that it is a multi-layered, multi-leveled answer that we don't have time for here today. Yeah. But it's definitely one that I think is important for us all to be willing to grapple with. And I know that there are a number of different alternatives that people are offering right now. And I also think that if we are operating within the systems that we have now, it is going to be critical for us to have that cross dialogue, to be able to see the people behind the experience or the neighborhood, right?
Yes.
Behind the job or the neighborhood. Because I think that, you know, as we talk about dismantling racism, period, you know, it is absolutely institutional. We cannot get around it. But what upholds institutions are people. The people are the ones that work within the institutions and that navigate the institutions and that uphold the institutions. And so if we can get to the people and begin dismantling and having conversations with them about messages that they've received, challenging that, imploring us to explore and listen more to different people's experiences, even when, and even more so when it is absolutely opposite to our own experience, right? Absolutely. Because there's something to be learned behind that. So tell me, what's the thing that you're most proud of in championing diversity at the TPD?
I have to admit that I had some biases about the kind of reaction we were going to get, especially from the older officers.
Yeah.
So I own that. I'm most proud of what I saw from our officers. Our officers are college educated and they're critical thinkers. And I didn't know whether I would get blank stares for a year, or anger or pushback. But they surprised us. They surprised me. I shouldn't speak for anybody else. They had such great insight, and they had ideas that I thought, hey, I want to add you to this group, you know, to teach. Yeah. One supervisor named Phil Whitehead, he shared, he worked an overnight shift on graveyard, and he said that every night he goes out and attempts to have 7 positive contacts with people throughout the night. The negative contacts are going to come because somebody calls the police and we show up. And either you've been the victim of a crime, you might be suspected of committing a crime, or maybe you're getting a ticket, and none of those are necessarily pleasant interactions to varying degrees. And so he set out to intentionally have positive interactions. So whether that was holding a door for somebody at Quick Trip when he's on his coffee break, or kneeling down and getting eye to eye with a little kid and talking to him for a little bit, or any opportunity that you'd have. I know several officers that even when they have to take somebody to jail, they start talking to that person on the way to jail. And oftentimes by the end of it, you know, there's no hard feelings. And when they see each other again on the street, there's actually positive interactions. I recall when I was a pretty young officer, I was visiting my son AJ, who was just a year old, at his preschool. And a car pulled up with 3 young people in it, and they were all looking at me and pointing at me. And one of them got out, and I thought, uh-oh, you know, I'm in uniform. You know, what does that represent to them? Are they mad at me? And a guy got out and said, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, I really don't. He said, "You've arrested me twice." I was like, oh,
wow.
no. I said, okay. And I felt badly, you know, but I didn't know who he was. And
Yeah.
he said, "But you were really cool to me, and I appreciate that. You treat me with respect." Thank goodness, you know. We have a beat system in Tulsa, and so officers work the same small geographic area for an entire year at least, if not longer, and you get to know the people in that area. And so effective community policing is getting to know the people, the ones who are causing problems and the ones who are trying to help. And depending on what neighborhood you're in, that may look like, that, you know, they may not be, they're going to walk out on their patio and sit down and tell you everything that's going on. And so sometimes I remember a former homicide detective said that he would leave his business card in the door so they could call later, you know, without people watching them. I didn't invent this, but I've used it. I would hide witness statements underneath my shirt and then walk inside a house and have them fill it out and stuff it back so nobody knew that they were helping. Just to protect them in case they're in a difficult situation in their neighborhood. They also shared troubling stories. A young officer, we were a few months into the curriculum, and he told a story that he thought painted a picture of part of the divide that we have. He said that he was on a call. It was a domestic assault call where a man strangled his girlfriend, not to death, but, you know, it choked her. And in this case, both the suspect and the victim were African American. The suspect in this case grabbed a butcher knife and he ran, and the officer chased him along with other officers, and they chased him for a few blocks, and eventually he was cornered, and so he turned around, he put the knife up to his neck in a suicidal posture, threatening to kill him. And the officers backed up, used really good de-escalation techniques, and over 45 minutes were able to negotiate him to surrender peacefully without hurting himself. And as they were taking him into custody, he leaned into the officer and hugged him and thanked him for not killing him and for showing compassion. And awesome story. And the officer said what happened next was very dispiriting. A member of the media pulled up, and they rolled down their window and they said, "What happened?" And so he started to tell the story, and they cut him off and said, "Did you shoot him?" "No, we didn't shoot him." Window up. Just dust. They wanted nothing more to hear about that. And that was tough because there was a positive outcome, and it wasn't good news. It wasn't worthy. And so I heard a lot about that from officers. And really, just to get back to your question, really good insight. The senior officers that I thought might have their walls up, they've been working the streets of Tulsa for 30 years. I mean, you know, they know diversity. You know, they've worked every possible neighborhood, and they found tools of how to communicate with different cultures. Even if they didn't have formal training, just a lifetime of experience, you know, really taught them, this is how you solve a problem. This is not how you solve a problem. And so they had a wealth of knowledge to add to the conversation that I expected our 3 and 4 year officers, the 20-somethings, the generation that intentionally seeks cultural competence, to lead the way. And they did. They had amazing insight, but I shouldn't have discounted our senior officers.
Yeah. Well, and one of them, I love how when she introduces herself in the training and she says, "Well, I've been here since the 1900s." Right? Because many of the officers will stand up and say that they joined in 2000 whatever. And she's like, "Well, I've been here since the 1900s. And so on one hand, it seems like, you know, that was a million years ago when you hear it like that. And then on the other hand, you know, it seems like it was yesterday.
Yes.
Well, so part of the training, we also talked about what are our cultural values, right? Because we wanted to explore the police as a culture as well. And if there's a culture of police, then there are without a doubt values and beliefs that we hold, and the ones that are likely universal, and not just for the Tulsa Police Department, but probably global, right, in terms of the culture of police officers. And so we came up with a couple of those throughout the process. But what do you think was the baseline culture that probably poses the greatest threat to working with communities of color specifically? Which of those values do you think pose the greatest threat?
Yeah, I think it is a value that a lot of cultures share, which is we are good. We are here. We're a force for good. A motto that a lot of police departments use, a force for good. We're the good guys. We signed up for this job for honorable reasons. I carry myself with honor every night. I serve whoever I come across, regardless of individual differences, equally. And so I'm tired of defending myself. Yeah. And so when somebody pushes back and shares an experience that was negative, the gut reaction is, hold on, I'm not racist. Most police officers are good. And what that does is it discounts that person's experience. We want to defend, for obvious reasons, the honor of the job that we chose. It's widely known that police officers are paid less than the private sector in general, work bad hours and bad days off, and it's a dangerous job. And they take that on because most of them felt a calling to do it. They wanted to help. And so when that calling is challenged, when somebody shares an experience, and like I mentioned earlier, every officer fears that new meeting with somebody, because it invariably ends up with the story of a bad cop that you met in whatever state and city that has nothing to do with me, but you're still going to hear the story because I think the uniformity of how we look tends to make it easier to lump us into one homogenous group with no differences. And so officers desperately want to defend who we are. In doing that, we miss important opportunities to show empathy. This is one that I've had to work really hard on, is when somebody comes to me with a horrific story, to not try to explain what happened from my point of view, my lens, and to not discount it, and to not defend my profession, but just sit back and listen and show empathy and appreciation for what they're saying. Whether or not, you think that it happened in the way they perceive it happened doesn't matter, because, their perception is reality. And the odds are something horrible did happen to them at the hands of law enforcement somewhere. And they need to know that you're willing to accept that, own that, and say, yeah, that's a horrible thing that happened to you. And I'm sorry that it happened. Tell me more about it. And right now, where police feel very much they're under attack for the actions of a few, it feels like making concessions, saying that there's areas where we could do better. There have been problems historically with the police, and today is putting fuel to the fire. And so I don't feel comfortable giving an inch right now, because you're going to run with that and take it out of context, or just add to the belief that all police officers are bad. And so I've taken calculated risk in acknowledging fault with people that I talk to, especially those who have experienced trauma, who are, is very raw, and just try to receive that without explaining or defending. And I think that we can move along the conversation along a little bit if I was better at that, if other police officers were better at that, rather than trying to say, no, that's not what I'm about. Okay, maybe it's not, but that person experienced that. And they need to know that an officer is willing to listen to that without judgment and without defensiveness.
Absolutely. And I think that that's, one of the greatest challenges that people are pushing back against, is that if that there's an immediate defense of the police and not the willingness to listen to the impacts. A friend of mine, an actor, posted on his Facebook page a little while ago, and he was employing his friends to when he explained some of the interactions that he had had with officers and his fear of those relationships and how they impact him when he stopped, that they didn't believe him. And so, and so he's saying, he goes, what would it take for you to believe me? Because I'm not asking for any favors, right? I just want you to hear me, because I think that if you hear me and you can believe me, then we can work together to begin to hold our systems accountable, right? Instead of feeling like it's going to be an either or. It's either going to be, you know, over policing in certain communities, or it's going to be no policing in certain communities. Yeah, so there should be a way for us to come together and have conversations about how can we continue to keep our community safe, but how can we also make sure that we don't see the people that we are working with in these communities as problems. Not all of them are problems, right? And a whole entire community is not responsible for the actions of a few, in the same way that the police are saying that all of the officers are not responsible for the actions of a few. Yeah. So, right. So now, what can we do as a community here in Tulsa specifically to close the gap between police and community relations? You know, that was one of our slides in the training, is that the whole purpose of what we were doing was to try to bridge that gap, right, between police and communities. And so, so what do you think are some things that we can do? Now, I know we can't solve the problems of the world and whatnot, but we both have some ideas on what we can do. So do you have any recommendations?
Yep. Okay, write this down. This is going to solve community police relations. I got anybody's watching.
It's recording.
Part of your curriculum that you gave us was a video from a police captain in Kansas City. Unfortunately, because of technical glitches, that video often wouldn't play. So I would send it out because it was so critical that people saw it. You know, he talked about, and then this was huge. You know, he said that they, in a area that was experiencing crime problems in Kansas City, that they enacted a zero tolerance policy. So people would get ticketed for anything, stopped for anything, and crime went up. And he said that somebody challenged him on that and said, you know, it's not working what we're doing. And his response was, yeah, but we're the police. This is what we do. You know, we enforce the law. And so as a police culture, as we take the big, slow turn towards what community engagement really means. And because there's literally tens of thousands of departments across the country with varying degrees of ability in that, you know, we have to look at best practices, who's doing it right, and enact those programs. And so I'm not here to shill for the Tulsa Police Department, so I'm not going to go into some of the initiatives that Chief Franklin has put out in depth, but you know, he's created a community engagement unit. Previously, that was shouldered by the community resource officers. That started off with Popsy Floyd down at 61st and Peoria, and had a lot of success and increasing trust and then decreasing crime at the same time. We know for a fact that stopping every car that moves does not stop crime. We also know that if we don't do proactive policing, we can't prevent crime. And so, you know, those two things alone are not the solution. And so with this community engagement unit, there's going to be the school resource officers, the community resource officers, the Riverside Bike Patrol. And there's going to be a overall strategy for the department to engage. And so, Captain Seibert, Shelly Seibert, who's leading that unit, you know, she said before that, you know, you can't win hearts and minds with barbecues, you know, alone. feeding people is not the only way to do that. There has to be constant positive interaction. So we've been given a directive to community policing is everybody's job. And that can be as simple as if you stop somebody and for a minor violation and you choose to use discretion not to cite them for it or arrest them, you can talk to them, say, hey, what's going on in your neighborhood? What's making life hard for you right now? Every stop, every call we go to, even an arrest, like I mentioned earlier, is an opportunity to have a positive interaction. And, one of the big errors in police shows on TV, which people love to watch, is that there's this antagonistic relationship between officers and people who have committed a crime. But oftentimes, it's, I got caught, I know I'm going to have to do some time, and, it's not personal. And oftentimes, that's the way that it turns out. And so in some of that is on the officers of treating people with respect and dignity. I was also taught early on in my career that no matter what a person did, no matter how much the crime offends you, you treat that person with dignity and respect. And that goes a long way, because there's a good chance you're going to see that person again. Pardon me, like I did outside my kid's school. And I was really, really glad that we had a positive interaction.
Yeah.
And people remember that. And so there's also, it's easier for me in management to have community meetings. I don't go to calls anymore, and I don't take anybody to jail. And so it's a difficult thing to do. But our officers, especially the ones who signed up in the last 4 years in post Michael Brown era, they knew that the job was getting harder. They knew that they were under a tighter microscope. They were going into the body cam era, where everything we do is recorded. I was told a story last night by one of my graveyard supervisors about an officer who was chasing a car that had just done a shooting, had just shot at somebody's house. And the officer chased one of the suspects into a wooded area, and they got into a tussle, and he had his body camera on, and the person he was fighting with tried to take the officer's gun out of his holster. He tried to pry it from him, obviously not for altruistic reasons.
Right.
And the officer looked down as he's struggling with this person and sees his body camera shut off. He thought, if I have to use force, what's going to happen to my life? What's going to happen to my family, my reputation, my department, my city? And so in the middle of a fight for his life, literally, he reached down and turned the body camera back on. And his supervisor scolded him, said, you have to, I understand why you did it, but you have to, this is a bridge too far, when your first concern is whether or not people are going to believe you, that you were doing what you had to do. Right. And so, there were some protesters outside my division here at Gilcrease Division last Thursday. And I want to say, when we're in a public forum here, praise Tulsans, as they always have, of the peaceful protest that they do. We learned that the people who showed up at the very end of the night to break things were not associated with the groups like Black Lives Matter. Right. That's important to say. But they invited me to come out with them and pray with them and kneel, and I'm always happy to kneel before God. And I took a knee with them and we prayed, and gave an interview afterwards. And I said that, this is not my quote, but I believe in it. The community can't talk to the police, and the police can't talk to the community, because we're just a big nebulous, group of people. There's no such thing as, direct communication, but Matt can talk to Kelli and Kelli can talk to Matt. And I can talk to people at community meetings, and officers can talk to people on calls and build that respect. A simple way is when you are about to take somebody to jail and they have family members that have gathered and they're filming you and they're frightened, is taking a minute to walk over and say, hey, here's what happened. Here's what he's going to jail for today. Here's where you can come pick him up. You're welcome to film. We want to be transparent here. And that extra 3 minutes does more to build trust. We don't have to do that, but we kind of do. Take the extra time, and officers do it regularly. Also, officers today, they have to be, I sent an email out to officers in my division. We have 179 people. that what they have to do is really inhuman. You have to go arrest somebody, you know, who just shot somebody potentially and might be armed, and maybe they're trying to hurt you. And the minute that the call is over, you have to switch into nurse mode, and you have to, you know, treat their injuries if they have any, provide an ambulance for them, you know, keep them safe. And it's all on video. So if you mess that up, everybody's going to see it in perpetuity. And I see them again and again. They use the force necessary, and then immediately, you know, they are treating the person like a family member, trying to help them, you know, providing the medical care if they need it. If they had to use a taser, getting the probes out and treating the site. And so that's a very difficult thing to ask a human being to do, to fight for their life, and then to care for that person and show compassion. But that's where we are, and that's what we have to do going forward to have credibility with our community.
Right, and frankly, part of the job, though, right? So
it is. It hasn't always been, but it is now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, we are in tough days, and I think that what's important about this conversation is that I think that what I was looking for in having this conversation was that there's light, right? And that there is hope, and that there are departments like ours that is trying to be intentional to work together to do this work. And we don't always get it right. And I think that because we are human and we are, you know, we make our mistakes and we make different, you know, choices that we have to deal with the consequences later. Yeah. And so I don't want to minimize the power of what is happening right now, and this global movement that's happening, and how people are feeling incredibly. On one hand, folks are feeling validated and finally seen and feeling uplifted and as if they matter. And then on the other hand, other people are feeling demonized and vilified, etc. And so my whole desire for having this conversation was to say that the problems of the world are big and they are vast. Yes. And this is one of the biggest ones. And I don't believe that anything can be done. As you said, a community cannot talk to the police department. Yeah. It has to be done one-to-one. And I think that as far as the work that we did together in the Tulsa Police Department, we started there, right? So we started with officers talking to other officers and having a conversation about what is important to know about the communities that they are working with, and why they hold the feelings that they hold. And so, you know, what I wanted to do was to be able to say that I think that there is a path forward, and acknowledging where we are, acknowledging the pain and the depth of the pain where we are, acknowledging the fact that there are so many things that are happening out here that as humans we cannot be proud of, but that we must do our part in whatever sphere of influence that we hold. Yes. And so as a consultant, that's my sphere of influence, right? Having the opportunity to work with the Tulsa Police Department, that is an additional sphere of influence. Having you as a partner in this work is so incredibly valuable to me, not just as a professional, but as a person. It helps to continue to help remind me that there are people behind the badge, right? Because it would be easy for me to only reduce you to you are a part of that system. So having the relationship with you is an important one for me as well.
Yeah, me too.
So before we go, I want to invite people, or invite us basically, to share some books that you think was that are important for people as they are on their journey. Do you have one that you'd like to share? And then I'll share one that I think is really important to this conversation, even more specifically.
As you helped guide me hand in hand into diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I was terrified of saying the wrong thing, of offending, of being current on the most appropriate language, vernacular. And so this book actually got at my first Return on Inclusion Summit. It is What If I Say the Wrong Thing?
Yeah.
Vernon Meyer was the keynote speaker that day, and it helped me a lot. And I won't summarize the books because it needs to be read. The book was helpful to me of trying to get it right. The least I can do for another human being is to try to treat them the way they want to be treated and understand where they're coming from. Short of that is lazy at best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so this is a book that I would recommend.
Yeah, excellent. It's a good one. Thank you for that. And I don't have it in front of me because it's on my bookshelf. I forgot to bring it in here. But the book that I recommend is called My Grandmother's Hands. And it's Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. And it's by Resmaa Menakem. And he talks about the importance of us to realize that racism has impacted each and every person, that we cannot assume that just because we are good people, that we have not been deeply impacted by racism. If we were born into the United States, then we are a part of a racialized country. And as a result, we have all experienced some level of trauma behind that. And we hold that trauma in our bodies, and that we need to begin to be mindful of that, pay attention to that, and do certain exercises in order to heal our bodies from that trauma. And so he talks specifically about the African-American or the Black experience, the white experience, and then the police experience, and healing those traumas. And so it is a fantastic book. I highly recommend. And it is one that helps us to see the humanity in one another. And so, Matt, I want to thank you for taking your time and sharing today. I know that this is a tough time to be in the hot seat, although I hope you don't feel as if you were in a hot seat with me. I was hoping to have a conversation, but I think that, knowing that the public discourse right now is not favorable to officers, to have an opportunity to share with you and to have this conversation with you is very valuable to me. So I want to thank you once more for saying yes.
No, thank you for the invitation. I cherish our friendship. I cherish everything that you've taught me. When I advertised this so that my friends might have a chance to learn too, I called you a mentor, and I meant that. You brought me along so far and taught me so much, and I'm grateful. You took a big risk to step up and partner for the Tulsa Police Department, especially for the penance that we paid you compared to what you're worth. But what you set in motion is huge. It's culture changing, and I thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. And everybody stay tuned for my next Stories of Inclusion, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye, Matt.